When the war began for Britain in August 1914, among the immediate shortages was of medical personnel, especially nurses. Britain had a rigid hierarchical system of nursing. Training, rank, and professional jobs were controlled by a limited number of institutions. Most nurses were of the lower middle class or working class, because nursing work was get your hands dirty work, which wealthier women were essentially forbidden to do. British nursing descended in a straight line from Florence Nightingale, who in the Crimean War embodied the argument that women were well suited for nursing because of their assumed empathy. Before then, nursing in hospitals and all nursing in war zones had been done by men. The rhetoric then was that nursing was a dirty business requiring physical strength, so not something that women could do. Florence Nightingale was herself the daughter of a reasonably well-off English family. She felt called to become a nurse, but her family expected her to marry instead, as was the typical life path for women of her class. Instead, defying her family's wishes, she attended nursing school in Germany at the Institution of Protestant Deaconesses. Strange name for a nursing school, right? Well, the earliest women nurses had been nuns, performing service in their communities by offering hospice care to the dying. Some of the terms used in British nursing, such as sister for a fully qualified nurse responsible for supervising others, or matron for the head nurse of a hospital, derived from the religious order background of nursing. Nightingale imported these terms into English usage from her training in Germany. Nightingale's biggest contribution to nursing, in a technical sense, was her insistence that hospitals be clean. When she arrived at the military hospital in the Crimea where she would serve, she discovered filthy conditions and a correspondingly high mortality rate. She set both her nurses and the most able-bodied patients to work scrubbing the walls and floor, made sure patients had clean bed linens, and took charge of keeping wounds clean. When she returned from the war, she established a nursing school in England that proved influential in training generations of nurses. Some features of English nursing at the time of the Great War that might be surprising to 21st century Americans include the hierarchical relation of nurses to patients. In some hospitals, nurses called patients by their patient numbers rather than by their names. Back in bed at once, 3192. Even in the 1960s in Britain, when nurses appear in stories, they are no-nonsense and treat patients like children, sort of like nannies with medical training. They typically have no patience for the ill-informed and novice. They typically have a great deal of pride in the rigorous training that enabled them to obtain one of the few professional jobs available to women in the early part of the century. Unlike nurses nowadays, who live wherever they like, nurses then usually lived in housing provided by their hospital or school, echoing the convents that were the original nursing homes. They were universally single, and typically spoke of their profession as a calling rather than a job or career. Enter the Great War. From the beginning, casualties overwhelmed existing medical systems, which had to ramp up capacities quickly. Doctors left civilian practice and joined the Royal Army Medical Corps. That's what W.H.R. Rivers did when he took leave of his job as a psychology professor at Cambridge and became a military psychiatrist for the duration of the war. Nurses were pressed into service, but this still didn't provide enough people to take care of all the patients. Of course, this problem was echoed in other fields as well. Men were needed at the front, and women had to take their jobs. Working-class women like Sarah Lum in Regeneration became factory workers and farmers and policewomen and bus drivers. An untapped source of labor during the war was middle-class and aristocratic women, who in normal times would stay home playing piano and attending garden parties while they awaited marriage. These women, for the most part, did not attend university, and they were barred from the professions of their fathers and brothers. Their educations were usually slighted in favor of their brothers. For example, Virginia Woolf, who described herself as a gentleman's daughter, had approximately zero money spent on her education. Her brothers attended expensive boarding schools, but she and her sister learned what they could at home, with her father paying for occasional tutors in specialized subjects like painting. Their role in society was strictly to marry well, and then to bear heirs for their husbands. They were decorative rather than useful. and so were the things they learned in school, if they were lucky enough to go to school. You see some of the implications of this at the beginning of Testament of Youth. The young Vera Brittain is intelligent and wants to learn. There is a women's college at Oxford that she could attend, but her father doesn't want to spend money on that. Instead, he buys her a piano that pleases her artistic brother, but not her. Of course, some young women of her class were only interested in hats and garden parties, just as some young women and men today are mostly interested in parties and fashion. But just like now, many young women wanted to see more of the world, to do more with their lives, and the social system in place just didn't allow this. When we talked about regeneration, we discussed how the war brought certain kinds of liberation for women. Sarah could earn a good living working in the munitions factory. She could live on her own, away from her mother, and could have the adult experiences she wanted, such as seeking a boyfriend of her taste rather than one of her mother's choice. She could spend her free time as she wished, with friends or on her own, rather than complying with her mother's vision for how a young woman of her age should act. The war also brought liberation to young women like Vera Brittain. It gave them a chance to leave home, to live independently, and to experience the world as persons in their own right, rather than as appendages of their parents and brothers. The VAD, Voluntary Aid Detachment, was a primary opportunity for this independence. The VAD had been founded about 5 years before the war, but was reasonably small. It provided a way for young women, who at that time were primarily of the lower middle class, to get nursing training without going through the rigorous training schemes of full-blown nurses. When the war began, and the need for additional nurses became clear, the VAD ramped up, and many young women of Vera Brittain's class joined, seeking to aid the war effort, to have an experience similar to their brothers at the front, and to get a little distance from home. These women received some training so that they could essentially act as nurses' aides, relieving the professional nurses of some of the less skilled hospital work, and in that way stretching the nation's resources. At the beginning of the war, they served exclusively in hospitals in Britain, but before long, they also found themselves near the front, at casualty clearing stations, on hospital trains and ships, and in mobile hospitals in France. I'm sure we can imagine the attitude of the professional nurses to the VADs, especially at the beginning of the war. Most of the young women volunteers had never worked a day in their lives at anything, a great contrast to the professional nurses. Their training was scanty, and their educations had not been rigorous, so their ability to act professionally in the hospital was probably limited. Remember the scene in Regeneration when Rivers comes upon the VADs helping Burns after he vomits at dinner? They run away giggling, girls rather than professional medical workers. Brittain definitely felt she had to earn the trust and respect of the sisters and matron over her. Their instinct was to assume that she was there for a lark and would quit and go home as soon as things got icky or challenging. And in many cases, professional nurses were right to feel that way. A good many of the VADs were looking to get away from their parents so they could have a good time, unsupervised. But of course, also in that group were young women who had always seen themselves in more professional ways. The same discipline that allowed Brittain to earn a place at Oxford, despite having no tutoring in the subjects required on the entrance exam, would also make her a competent nurse, a helpful colleague to the professional nurses she worked with. As you saw in the film, Brittain worked in both British hospitals and in France during her time in the VAD. She was exposed to many things her parents never imagined their upper-middle-class daughter would see. Her reasons for joining the VAD were exclusively honorable. If her brother and fiancé were fighting at the front, she wanted to be doing something useful and unselfish. She wanted to make a sacrifice commensurate with the sacrifices of soldiers. This week, we are reading an excerpt from Brittain's war memoir, Testament of Youth, in addition to watching the 2014 film of the book. This book, originally published in 1933, was a best-selling memoir, written as the great outflow of war writing was beginning to taper off. In the excerpt you read, you see a little bit of what life was like in a London war hospital, and you see some of the struggles of a young woman living in harsher conditions than she had experienced before, and finding out just how strong and dedicated she was. You also see the beginning of the great loss the war brought to Britain, the death of her fiancé, Roland Leighton. The film provides an overview of Britain's whole story and shows you the further extent of her loss during the war, as well as her heroic efforts as a nurse. In some ways, Britain is writing a story parallel to last week's book, The Forbidden Zone. Unlike Mary Borden, she is not rich enough to set up her own hospital, but like her, she is working in a field she never imagined for herself, seeing things she never thought she'd see. Britten's book is more conventionally structured than Borden's, and it is a true memoir. Borden was closer to the front lines than Britten, and so there again, her book sees the soldier patients somewhat differently. What other similarities can we find between Borden's and Britten's stories of nursing? What differences do you see in their texts? And how does the translation of Britten's memoir to film affect our relationship to the story?